Our next speaker this morning is John Remnant from the University of Nottingham.
Thank you, John, and thank you all for coming to hear me attempt to try and explain 3 randomised controlled trials in 12 minutes. So I'll see how I get on. Before I start, I did want to point out these trials have taken a lot of work from a lot of people. I certainly haven't done all of that. Particularly Hetty, whose PhD formed a lot of this work, and Ollie, who did a lot of this work for his residency, and John for looking after us all and winning the money to pay for it all. There's been lots of people contributing, so I just wanted to point that out at the start. So just to point out what I'm going to talk through, I'll start off with a bit of an introduction. Thankfully, a lot of the other speakers have covered a lot of the background to lameness. And then I'll talk you through the 3 trials we've done at Nottingham. One's on treating new cases of lameness. The second one's on treating cows that are chronically lame. And then the third trial is looking at a preventative trim at peak lactation in heifers. And then hopefully in about 11 and a half minutes' time, I'll summarise and tell you what I think it means and how we should try and implement this on farms. So the trials were focusing on clawhorn disease. So I thought by way of an introduction, I should just check we all mean the same thing when I say that. So by the clawhorn diseases, we mean sole ulcers and sole hemorrhage. And you can see these are quite advanced lesions here. So we've got a full sole ulcer here and here, some very severe bruising. And then some slightly earlier and milder lesions, and these would be a lot more typical of the acute lame trial when cows were being detected and treated very promptly. So you can see there's no full thickness lesions, but this hemorrhage at the same sole ulcer site. And we also included in the trial cases of white line disease. Again, these are slightly more severe lesions. These are probably more typical of the cows in the chronic study. And then some earlier lesions where you can see there's some hemorrhage here on the white line, some slight separation in some of them, but much earlier. But we counted all of these as clawhorn lesions. We did analyse the lesions separately, but the results I'll present are looking at treating any of these conditions. So to give it a bit of background, we've heard a lot about preventing lameness today, and clearly prevention of lameness should be our ultimate goal. As Nigel was saying, 25% of dairy cows, probably at a best guess, are lame at any one time. So whilst I think we really should focus our effort on prevention, the idea that we don't need to find the best way of treating these, at the moment, unfortunately, that isn't an option. So back in just after 2011, Sarah Potterton and a group of researchers from Nottingham and Bristol and some other collaborators did a systematic review of the literature, looking at peer-reviewed literature on how to treat cases of lameness. And I was in practice at this stage and treating lame cows and thinking all those things I've been told, surely there's a massive evidence base, well proven. People wouldn't have told me to do this stuff if there wasn't any evidence. So in this study they found 3 papers published between 2000 and 2011 that covered the treatment of sole ulcers in dairy cows. 2 of those were on the use of biotin in feed to treat it, so interesting work, but probably not relevant for treating an individual lame cow. And that left 1 paper. I don't know if Mike Pyman's here today, but that was one of Mike Pyman's papers comparing foot blocks and bandages. So despite the fact I'm sure almost all of us are treating these conditions on a relatively frequent basis, there's very little evidence for the best way to treat them. And that doesn't mean what we're doing is wrong, but it means we should probably take some steps to try and find out what the absolute best way of treating those quarter of all dairy cows that seem to be lame. So now I'll talk you through the trials. I'm going to outline the methods very briefly just to try and focus on the key points. But like I say, this first trial was a randomised controlled trial of newly lame cows. These are dairy cows. They were mobility scored or locomotion scored. We used the UK industry scale, which is a 0 to 3 scale. We broke the 2s and 3s into 2A and 2B, and 3A and 3B for a bit more sort of resolution for when we analysed it. The study was carried out for 12 months on 6 farms, and we looked at new cases of lameness only. So these were cows that hadn't been detected lame before in the trial, that were only lame on 1 foot and had had no prior treatment. So that left us with 183 cows enrolled in the trial. they had to have only one claw affected, and that was so we could randomly allocate our treatments. And that did cause, I should flag up Hetty again here, who did a lot of the trimming on these cows. A lot of the cows that were treated weren't eligible for enrolment in the study, so I think that must have been quite demoralising at times, but hopefully she's very pleased with the outcomes. So the cows, once they were enrolled, were randomly allocated to receive a 5-step trim on its own, a 5-step trim and the application of a block to the sound claw, a trim and a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, we used ketoprofen, and then a trim, block and a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. So 4 different treatment groups. And then the blocks were removed 4 weeks later, and the cows were locomotion scored again. Always use the term blind observer here. Obviously, they weren't blind because they locomotion scored them, but they didn't know how the animals were treated, and that was why we removed the blocks, so that there was no way the person doing the outcome assessment could tell which treatment group the cows were in. So I'll jump straight in with the results. Using the UK 0 to 3 scale, a 0 score cow is considered to have perfect mobility, but we would generally consider score 0 on 1 cows to be not lame. So it's the 2s and 3s that are lame. So in the left-hand column, you can see that that was the percentage that were sound, perfect mobility, 5 weeks later. So they were score 0. And then in the right-hand column, you can see the ones that were non-lame, so score 0 or 1. And you can see that the number that were non-lame, we're looking at about 3/4 of the cows, so it looks like our treatment did do something, although it still leaves a quarter of them still lame 6 weeks later. But when you look down the column, you can see the statistically significant effect in this trial was that the trim, block and anti-inflammatory was significantly more likely to result in a cow being non-lame at the outcome than just a trim. But you can see also the effect of the block and non-steroidal seem to combine together, so that it's not just the same effect as the individual ones, that seem to have a much more dramatic effect when used in combination. So I think what we can conclude from this is that treatment with a trim, a block and a non-steroidal is most effective. So I would suggest, following this, that we should use foot blocks wherever possible to treat these lesions, and that we should always consider administering a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug at the same time as applying the foot block and treating cases of lameness. So the second trial is very similar. It's a randomised controlled trial looking at chronically lame cows. It's a very similar design, slightly different herds, although some are the same. Cows were scored 2 weeks apart. This time, instead of being a new case of lameness, a cow that went from a score 0 or 1 to a 2 or 3, these were cows that had scored a score 2 or 3 at 2 scorings within a 3 scoring period. So they'd been lame for 2 scores out of 6 weeks of scoring. So although we're calling this chronic, compared to some of the lameness lesions that would be picked up on farms and selected by farmers, these are probably still relatively early. So that they could have been lame for up to about 6 weeks at the point of treatment, which a lot of the research would suggest that cows are often picked out at a much later stage. Again, they were randomly allocated to treatment groups, trim only, trim and a trim block and a non-steroidal, and we had about 150 cows enrolled in this study. And again, the outcome was assessed by mobility scoring to someone that didn't know which treatment group the cows were in. So the results are presented very similarly here. The left-hand column is the percentage that were non-lame after 6 weeks. And then so that's the score 0 or 1. That was the better sort of looking outcome in the previous study. And then the percentage where the mobility score reduced. So they were less lame, but possibly still lame at the outcome. And I think the really striking thing in this trial is that left-hand column in the previous study, so treating around 2 weeks after lameness was diagnosed, we were getting cure rates of 75% plus in some of the groups. And in this study, there was no significant difference between the treatment groups, and we were looking at an outcome of about 15%. 1 in 8 cows, instead of 3 out of 4, were still lame 6 weeks later. The percentage that improved is much higher. I guess an improvement when you're still lame probably isn't anything to get that excited about. I guess there's a tendency for the highest scores, they can only really move in one direction. The other interesting thing in this study was when we looked at the data and which leg the cow scored lame on, if we remove the cows that were lame on the opposite leg at the outcome to the one they were lame on at enrolment, then actually we see a lot more getting better. The number of cows that we could keep in the study or keep in the analysis was a lot lower then. But actually a lot of these cows seemed to recover on the leg we treated, but became lame on the other leg. So that did confound the results slightly. The cows were still lame, but potentially our treatments were effective on the leg we treated, and we just should have considered doing something with the other leg. So I think thank you, I've only been talking for 2 minutes, so I've got a long time left. So the conclusions I'd make from this study, well, the cure rate is massively reduced compared to acutely lame cows. So we should be diagnosing these as quickly as possible and treating them as early as possible. And for me, the only way to do that is to locomotion or mobility score them. These aren't the ones you spot limping into the parlour. These are the ones you've gone out and looked for. And that they're often lame or becoming lame on the other leg, which when we think about the potential etiologies of this makes perfect sense. It would seem odd that those risk factors would only apply to one limb with most of these conditions. So I think we should probably be considering treating both legs either at the same time or within a very close time period. So the final study is a bit different. This was a randomised controlled trial looking at a preventative trim in first lactation heifers in block calving herds over 8 farms, and 282 heifers were enrolled, and they were randomly assigned to receive either a trim or no treatment 50 to 80 days, so sort of early lactation trim. And with this we looked at milk yield as an outcome, and they were locomotion scored at enrolment as well. And the results of this study flagged up something that often appears in the literature, that we should keep our heifers as lame as possible, because the lame heifers seem to produce more milk. And I suspect actually that's probably a good example of correlation and not causation, because we'd guess probably it's the higher producing heifers that are perhaps at higher risk. So the analysis of this was a bit more complicated. We had to try and unravel those relationships rather than just looking at the effect of our trim. We had to break it down in whether they were lame when they were treated or whether they weren't lame, and then which treatment group they were in. So if we compare to our baseline of no trim in a cow that wasn't lame, the lame cows produce more milk, but the ones that were lame and didn't receive a trim produced about 444 more litres of milk over that 305-day lactation. But then when we look at the ones that were lame on the day and were trimmed, we get significantly more milk from them. And actually we get more milk as well from the ones that weren't lame on the day, but we did trim. So it's slightly more tricky to pick out what was going on here. Ollie Maxwell, the person that did a lot of the work in this study, did find that the frightening thing about this was these first lactation heifers, even the ones that weren't lame, the number of feet he picked up with quite advanced lesions on the claws was worrying. And I think, again, this supports what we found in the other studies. Treating these cases early, particularly in the heifers, is going to be absolutely key. So I think we conclude from this one, lame heifers do produce more milk, or heifers that produce more milk are more likely to be lame. There's a substantial improvement in milk production if we do trim the lame heifers, and we probably need to detect those early. And there's some improvement in milk production if a non-lame heifer is trimmed, but it looks like the biggest effect is a very quick treatment of the lame ones. So I think we should identify and treat those lame heifers as soon as we possibly can. So just to outline what I think the key take-home messages are here, I think it's important we're honest with this. The evidence base in this area is very limited, and I think there's a lot more to do. I mean, there's endless questions that still need to be answered. I think the best type of block, the best type of trim, whether to remove the blocks, and what to do when both claws are affected. So one of the reasons Hetty in the first study had to pick up so many cows' feet and treat them but wasn't able to enrol them was because often both claws would be affected and we didn't feel like it would be appropriate to apply a block in those cases. So trying to decide what to do with those is going to be important. But I think we can be sure that foot blocks and non-steroidals do improve the outcomes in newly lame cows. And clearly, and there's lots of other research to support this, early and effective treatment is key. So detecting these cows as early as possible and treating them as quickly as possible is fundamental to reducing the amount of time they're lame. And I think we should probably be thinking about treating both back legs in a lame cow if at all possible. Whether that's at the same time, that's probably going to be quite uncomfortable for the cow, or at least very soon after the first trim. I think that's going to be key. So Just to finish off, I'd like to thank the people that funded the work. So AHDB Dairy are the UK's levy board, and the BVA's Animal Welfare Foundation funded a lot of this work. And also, as well as my co-authors that I mentioned at the beginning, we're a really big group at Nottingham. Lots of people in the group have contributed to this work. It certainly is a team effort, and if you'd like to keep up to date with the work we're doing, the web address and our Twitter account, if you're into that sort of thing, it's just up here. Thank you very much.